Welcome to Understanding Project Management Discussions. My name is Dave Barrett. My guest today is Anand Sreekumar. Anand is both a faculty member at Conestoga and also a practicing project manager. Our topic today is project procurement. Through our discussion, you'll see the breadth and complexity in terms of the documentation required during project procurement. There's also discussion regarding the interplay between the buying side project manager and the selling side project manager. Please welcome Anand Sreekumar. Right. So when you were involved in project procurement, were you on the sort of selling side, that you were in the organization that was, trying to sell the good or service to the buyer, or were you on the buying side? So, or have you been in both?
I've been on both sides. And so from my experience, from a selling side, if you're a project manager and you have to deliver a project, and the organizations makes the make or buy decision that you mentioned in your textbook, you still have to manage that project once it's made or it's bought, right? So when you're a project manager on the buyer side, you are in many times part of the procurement and tender process, and you could be, depending on I guess on your experience and your profile in the organization, you could be part of the process of collecting the information that's needed for that particular tender or that procurement process that's needed. On the buyer side, I would say, as a sorry, on the seller side, I would say it's a little bit different, because yes, I have been involved in it, but as a PM, sometimes you're, in my experience at least, sometimes you're involved in preparing up a tender, preparing up a proposal towards the tender or the RFI or RFQ or whatever it is that you're responding to. But in most instances, I've noticed that the PM comes into play after the tender has been awarded, or to a particular organization. So after the business development wing or the sales wing basically has got a contract from as part of a procurement of a buyer, you basically as a seller jump in, and you're handed over the reins from your sales team. And as a seller, you are trying to meet the needs of the buyer and adhere to the project contract terms that have been agreed.
Right. Okay, so let's start to break this down, because we've been flipping back and forth between buyer and seller. So let's take it from the point of view. Let's just talk for a moment as you're on the buying side. So you're in the organization that's going to receive the good or service. You're going to create the RFP or RFI or RFQ, but let's just assume it's an RFP. In the statement of work, what's the biggest challenge when you're involved in that process? So sort of walk us through that of how do you find those steps that are described in those early buying activities?
So I would say one of the greatest challenges is always ensuring that there is enough detail in a proposal, in an RFP that you create, so that all suppliers are on the same footing when they receive the tender document, right? So if we put enough information in there, and ensuring that there is enough information to give every supplier enough background and enough documentation to review and give an informed and thorough proposal in response to your tender. I feel that's always a challenge, to ensure that you're getting everything across to your commercial team when they basically take the information and then put in all the commercial and legal framework for them to issue it in the public, if it's a public tender or otherwise. So yeah, I would say that is one of the greatest challenges.
So how much time does And I know this is a tough question because you've probably been involved in big projects and small projects from a buyer side, but what would be the, maybe the average amount of time to create that RFP, and what would be the biggest you've ever, what's the most that you've ever been involved in, just as a, like,
Um,
generally speaking, approximately?
so approximately, I would say 4 months would be 4 to 6 months would be a larger RFP
Right.
creation.
So
Uh,
4 to 6 months. So how big is that document? Like, if you were to print it out, how big would it be? Like,
um,
again, just approximately. I know that's a tough question to ask, but how are we talking the size of a, anyways, how big do you think it would be?
I mean, it it's basically all the supporting documentation, right? That kind of builds the size to it. Again, I mean, I would say 6 months is probably even like it's not a very large scale project. A very large scale project, the contracts itself are many booklets, you could say. Um, However, for 6 months, the large part of the documentation would be the kind of documentation that you require, you put in to support the proposal, and also the kind of, all the kind of general tender documentation, and any kind of other supporting information. Again, a lot of it is dependent on the type of organization and the type, whether it's,
Sure.
public or non-public, because there are a lot of expected uh, items that, are needed to put in there uh, as requirements from a particular supplier.
Right.
So, and then let's not even get to the part of when the supplier returns back with this documentation, which is, it's massive in itself, and it has to be reviewed by various teams. Um, my experience is that sometimes suppliers are asked to give a commercial proposal and a technical proposal, and around, multiple copies of it separately, so that different teams are given those dockets of information to review, to make an informed feedback on the decision. So
Right. So just to review, and this is the kind of thing that, sometimes I struggle to even describe this in the text or in class, which is just how big RFPs and how detailed they can become. Like, just to kind of try to conceptualize that, of 4 to 6 months of multiple people working on one, like you're
yeah.
writing a small, or moderately sized book at that point. Um,
Yeah,
you
I
know,
guess
so
book would be
yeah,
it would be extreme. But I mean, I would recommend, like, anybody would be able to go to the public, government sites to see, tenders that are out there, and
right,
if they look at tender documents for large projects that have been, released by the government, at least the ones that are available to be seen. You will see the amount of documentation that's in there
right.
to support, like a project, and the end goal is, I would say, is always like to get as much information out there so that you get an apples to apples kind of proposal in return.
Right. And it's very important. I think, as you mentioned before, it's very important that, you're getting as much information and the same information out to multiple suppliers.
Yes,
You're not
yeah, and
telling one
yeah.
person, a little secret to one person or one company, and then another little secret to another company.
No,
It's,
yeah, and then
it's
that's
very
that's a
important.
that's a good point you brought in, Dave, because every vendor, as part of a procurement process, comes back with questions, and good practice is to respond to each vendor's questions. Like, if vendor, or let's say supplier one, asks 4 questions, and supplier two asks 3 questions. So you take those 7 questions, and let's say you're 10 suppliers who are bidding for this particular work. You give the responses to all of them, so that at the same time, so that, they have that same amount of information, and they are not at a disadvantage when they're responding to the tender.
So how do you, when you described before a little bit, the next further step in the process where you get multiple responses back from different suppliers or vendors, and so you've
Yeah,
got, you know, these proposals or responses on your desk.
yeah.
How have you seen organizations, what's the process they've used to sort through and to choose one? Because ultimately you got to get down to one in most
Yeah.
cases.
So for the Q&A sessions, what I've noticed is the organization holds one or two, mostly one I've noticed, session for all participants, and they can all come and attend and ask questions. So instead of the back and forth over correspondence, you have one session where all vendors can basically look at what the questions are being asked by other vendors or themselves, and listen to the response from everyone, so that again everybody is on the same page. In terms of what is the next, how it is evaluated, normally it is put in the proposal, sorry, in the tender, that this is how the different weightages and the different components on evaluation of a particular tender. And then what I've seen is that it then gets distributed to various divisions within an organization or within a government unit, and and they come up and weigh and score against those. Sorry, they score against the various weights that's been put in and pre-agreed. And this is not created after a tender is released. This is created during, and it is shared with the different suppliers. So when the proposals come back, everybody knows what they're going to be, what they're going to be scored against. So let's say you have four components, and component A is 50% and component B is 10%. This allows the supplier to give a lot more content and information on A, as opposed to giving a lot more on B and not enough information about A, so that they know that the evaluators are looking at component A as opposed to component B.
Right. So it's sort of like you're letting the suppliers know the rules of the game
Yeah,
before they play the game. Like
yeah,
it's kind of like if you're going to have a soccer team come and play soccer and you didn't tell them the rules, how could they
yeah,
play? So
exactly.
that's an important. Is there any, from your experience, have you had, and again, this is from the buyer side, have you had a you know, the whole RFP selection process that kind of didn't work out? Like, is there any, and I know you can't describe actual companies and so on, but has there been any situations where you went, ooh, we should have done X or Y, and
Mm,
maybe didn't choose the right one?
um, I would say that if procurement exercise happens after a lot of thought, and it is a big decision, and it's a lot of resource. It takes up a lot of resources. So if you have come to that position after a tender process, I no, I don't believe I've been part of a tender process where something was not awarded. Of course, there could be delays to
Yeah.
awarding uh, because of many different things, but no,
Okay.
not being awarded again. So this is from let's say a public um, or like government sector, where I've been both part of the um, you know giving from the seller side as well as the buyer side. But from, let's say, the private sector, you can always have procurements that start off but are put on hold for a while, and let's say they, I mean, but it's very rare that I've seen that a public tender or a public or like an RFP has gone out, and there has been no decision made, or the RFP has been completely changed. Not saying that it doesn't happen, um, but I've not been involved in those.
That's good. That's good. Before we just move on to the selling side for a little bit, just one thing I wanted to talk about was the whole creation of the contract. What can you tell us about contract writing? Is that an easy thing? Is that something
Uh,
that's done quickly, or how can you characterize contracts?
I guess contract writing is normally, I don't think a PM would be, at least from my experience, won't be the one writing or drafting up contracts. It would normally be a legal or commercial team that probably has templates for contracts that has been pre-approved if it is to be done quickly. But that wouldn't be the case for like large contracts. That would have to be thoroughly reviewed and vetted before it is released for signing by both parties. It is I've seen massive contracts with many schedules supporting it that goes into, as you said, books, right? The size of books, literally.
Right. Well, that's been my experience. Yeah.
So like that can take time.
Yes,
right?
That's been my experience. That oftentimes, at least where I've found, and at least in some instances, it seems like the creation of the contract seems like practically as long as the creation of everything else, because of you get down into the the really nitty gritty details of legality. So so I just want to flip to the seller side just for a moment. We've been focusing more on the buyer side, but you mentioned that you do have some experience from the, being in the organization that is receiving RFPs and now need to communicate their proposals and so on. So from that perspective, being on that team, whether it's on a project team or on the team that's, the organizational, the business development team, what's the greatest challenge you see there? Like what's their challenge?
I think from that, as you said, it's a business development activity and less of a PM activity. And I guess it's all about making sure that you are giving enough value for the kind of proposal that you're putting out there, so that you let the client know that your proposal is superior to the competition's. And I guess a lot of it is always trying to double guess what the competition is going to do and going to propose. So as I said, it's less of a PM task, but more of a BD or a business development task. So you're always trying to see what the competition is doing and try to see how you can differentiate yourself and add value, and try to provide a proposal that gets awarded by. Basically.
Understanding those valuation criteria and working to it. And no, I agree. When we think of project management, it's normally on the other side, on the buying side and so on, because that process takes place. But I've always felt that, as a project manager, it's useful to understand the selling side, because you're going to be receiving that proposal. Again, I'm back on the buyer side. I'm going to receive the proposal from the seller, and understanding what they do and how they work is important to evaluation. So
I would also say that there's also, remember that if a seller gets awarded a contract, the seller assigns a PM.
Yes.
So there is a seller side PM that has to manage the project. So you can be a PM on the seller side, but most likely it will not be as part of the contract tendering process, but it will be more when the contract is awarded. So
yes,
and then you'll have this relationship between two PMs, where you have the seller side PM and the buyer side PM, trying to align and ensuring that they can work together. And
and how do you find that? Have you been involved as one or the other of the PMs?
Yeah, so I've had to manage a lot of let's say suppliers in various projects. So in from a buyer's perspective, you kind of see that you have a lot more. Let's say you feel that you have a lot less control, because you're now a few degrees away from the granular level of delivering the project, as opposed to having the materials and the resources are now not directly under your control, but there is a layer in between, which is the supplier. And
Right.
the supplier is, is probably working on multiple projects, and their resources are going to be based on the number of projects that they're doing, and probably the level of importance and the amount of, I guess, the contract award budgets that will set some of the priorities at some point in terms of uh, how quickly they respond to you. So
So what's your
it's
strategy in those cases? Like let's again, so assume you're the PM for the buyer side.
yeah,
You're dealing with the supplier side PM.
yeah.
What strategies have you used to get them to pay attention to you or get your project done while you know they might be dealing with multiple other projects? Like what do you do?
I mean, right from the offset, I mean, you ask like, you set your expectations on what the project is and what it is meant to achieve, and the deadlines and so on, and the budget estimates that have been shared and on the basis of what the contract is awarded. So you basically set expectations in the beginning, and you try to build a working relationship with the PM.
Mhm.
And again, a lot of it also depends on the size of your organization. If you are doing this from a large organization, normally the vendor, they have assigned full-time PMs. And again, while some of these things are, I mean, one of the things that I don't like to turn to is to um, basically try to refer back to the KPIs and the contract, because you only do that when things are going wrong, and you don't want to do that right at the start. But you communicate that in the beginning, um, and you communicate at the beginning. But when you see things are deviating from the plan, then you basically have to ensure that you meet your KPIs and that your vendor or supplier adheres to what they have contractually obliged to. Uh,
Right.
but that's always that is when things get a little bit more, let's say, interesting.
Yeah, like almost I like the fact, I just want to highlight the fact that you said, one of the things you do is build the relationship between like good stakeholder management where you're building that in, and you do have the KPI, the key performance indicators and the contract, but that's not your first, if you keep bringing that out, you
Yeah,
time you do that, if every time there's some tiny little problem, you show them the contract, it
yeah,
detracts from the relationship. It's a
yeah,
it's a game of give and take and so on. And that's true on all types of project management, but true in procurement
yeah.
projects. Well,
Very, very, very much. Yeah.
really good point.
Yeah, it's yeah, I mean, managing supplier project managers also makes your life sometimes easier, because because of the fact that you don't have to directly manage resources or materials. um, you are pretty much managing the entire supplier organization, you can say. So it is within their remit to basically deliver certain things.
Right.
um, so in some ways it is easier, and then what happens is, then you are managing multiple projects and you're allowed to scale, as opposed to being a PM who has to directly manage these projects. So again, this is kind of where the make or buy decision was made, depending on the core competency of the organization.
Right.
But yeah, there are definitely different aspects to, uh, from a buyer side PM, as opposed to a seller side PM.
Yeah, no, that's a I think you've hit the, just to sort of, if I would just to speak that back to you, that there are advantages. You don't have to directly manage the resources like you do if it's an internal project. But on the other hand, you can't, if there's an issue, you can't walk down the hall or necessarily call
Mm,
the engineer or developer um, to fix it. You're working through a PM on the
yeah,
seller side, which is both, there's good parts about that, but there's challenging parts about that. So it it
yeah,
it makes the whole area of procurement really rich and interesting from a development point of view. So anyways, no, Anand, I appreciate your time and your expertise on this. This has been a really interesting discussion about procurement. So, you know, thank you very much for this, and good luck on your future projects.
Thank you so much, Dave.
Okay, we'll talk again soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.